As a brave soul that wants to start with any reply would make my life easier. Yeah.
I've got one general question, which I think, like this,
Question.
this is a question for everyone, and I think the answer that you give to this question will fundamentally determine where you sit on questions of correlation. We won't give a complete answer, but I think for me it's the fundamental question, because this is the responses to answers here and the arguments that you'll have, that's what will determine where you end up, right? And the question is, are there such things as universal structures of thought, right? What's your answer to that, right? If your answer to that is no, right, under no circumstances can we identify universal structures of thought, you are a strong correlationist, right? No matter what you will defend the plurality in different ways, you will have different ways of articulating it, right? But you are a strong correlationist, that's just where you are, right? If you say yes, there are universal structures of thought, right? You can still be a weak correlationist, right? In fact, you can still be a strong correlationist, you can be yourself, right? Kant might count on that front because it's not all pluralism, right? But you could also be Kant and say, look, the categories, they apply to everything, it's just forms of sensibility there. But there is something fundamentally universal, right? This is my response to the Brandonian quietism. Don't mean to be too. There's an additional position you can take, which is what I call deflationary realism. You can say there are such things as universal structures of thought, right? But what there aren't is universal structures of being distinct from those structures, right? And what I mean by that is there isn't such a thing as metaphysics, right? All you can do, if you want to describe universals, all you can do is do semantics, right? And this is basically Brandon's modal realism. Brandon's modal realism is, look, we just talk in modal ways, there's nothing more that can be said about it, that's it. That's Brandon's objective idealism is. There's nothing more than describing universal structures of thought. There's no more than metaphysics, right? Finally, you have to both say there's universal structures of thought and say there's universal structures of being if you want to do something resembling classical metaphysics, albeit in a post-critical way. That's the range of spectrum, but it all comes fundamentally from whether you're even willing to admit that we can do some kind of minimal transcendental analysis of what thought is. Feel free to disagree with me, anyone, but I think that's the spectrum that we're working on.
Can I jump in to answer the question that was posed to me?
Yeah, go for it.
Sorry, because it's an interesting one, I think, and it actually it brings up a question that came up after my talk. I think Ray was pushing this question because I was using the word skepticism in a kind of sloppy way, and I was sort of bracketing the question about whether Heidegger or Wittgenstein or me or whoever ought to be called a strong correlationist, because I'm not happy with that term. I'm not sure what it means. So I think my discussion at that point got kind of messy because I wasn't keeping in mind distinctions. So the distinctions that I should have drawn more clearly are these. Strong correlationism sometimes sounds like, correlationism generally sounds like the idea that claims about things in themselves are just not permitted. Right? You can't say that move. You can't say anything like that because anything you say, that's to say you can't make these strong realist claims because after all, that's just how it is to you. I mean, that's the knee-jerk sort of move. And I wanted to say Heidegger's not a correlationist in that sense because he has a robustly realistic view about reality, the entities purely present at hand. They do not depend on Dasein. So in that sense, he's not a correlationist. The sense in which I was sort of, for the moment, conceding that, okay, if you want to call Heidegger a strong correlationist, you can, is a different sort of correlationism. And that, I take it to be something like the way that things show up for us and are intelligible to us and manifest themselves is radically contingent or factical. and specifically relative to however they may be in themselves. In that sense, okay, if that's strong correlationism, then yes, he thinks this goes back to the contingency or facticity of the way things manage to show. So I was sort of conceding the term correlationism provisionally, so that in that sense he's a correlationist, and then my main argument was I don't see why he should relinquish that and admit that that kind of facticity has any sort of further kind of necessity, which is what Meillassoux was trying to assert. So that's to say, since there's two things you could mean by strong correlationism, there's of course, as we've found out, many things one can mean by things in themselves. And there's two different things you could mean by things in themselves corresponding to those notions of correlationism. The sense in which Heidegger's a realist about things in themselves is not Kantian things in themselves. It's things independent of our ways of representing or thinking about them or understanding them. And that's what Heidegger thinks the science can actually reveal. So it's a bit more Sellarsian, right? There's a scientific picture that can show you the way things are. They're not inaccessible things in themselves in a Kantian sense. You might, by things in themselves, mean something different, but that's what I had in mind when I said there's this distinct, Heidegger's a realist about those. So when it comes to the word skepticism, I shouldn't have used it at all, because you're exactly right. Where's the speaker? Where's the person who asked me this question? Oh, you're behind him. Okay, you're included. The question of global skepticism that Heidegger's addressing in Being and Time when he brings up the problem of the external world, and that Wittgenstein is interested in, that's a completely different question, I think, from this kind of what Meillassoux calls this agnosticism about how things may be independently of or otherwise then they show up for us and manifest themselves. So I shouldn't have used the word skepticism at all, because it confuses the issue. So you're absolutely right that from the get-go, Heidegger, like Wittgenstein, will not admit any kind of global skepticism because he thinks that's just incoherent. But remember what he says about it is the question of the existence of the external world, and I think that probably also means not just the existence of the external world, but its being in a lot of ways like it shows up for us. He says that cannot be a coherent question for Dasein, and who else is asking, right? So it's still sort of relative to Dasein. Now, the whole thing is that the question can only be a question for Dasein, and that's the terms on which he rejects it as incoherent. So he's very much on the same page with Wittgenstein and a lot of other philosophers in the 20th century. So I completely agree with what you're saying. And the question that I meant to be addressing was really sort of a different one, which is, given that we can't be skeptics about, say, the life world, the world, as it shows up for us, in sort of, you just cannot. That's incoherent. But I think there's a sensible kind of, don't call it skepticism, but agnosticism, which I think is just healthy scientific sort of skepticism, which is the way things are, independently of any of the ways in which they show up for us, can absolutely be radically, in fact they're turning out to be, radically different from the ways in which they show up for us. And that's a different issue. It's an accident that you might call it skepticism, because it doesn't have much bearing on philosophical skepticism. It's a perfectly reasonable sort of thing to be skeptical about, and given that all the things we're finding out from the sciences about the structure of reality independent of us, sure we ought to be skeptical about that. And that's why I was trying to insist that Heidegger does or ought to, or we ought to, dig our heels in and not then admit the further speculative modal claim that Meillassoux seems to just sort of pull out of a hat, as far as I can tell. So I completely agree with what you're saying. It calls for further distinctions.
I did have a thought on Pete's question, a very tricky one about universal structures of thought. In Kant and Sellars, and then Meillassoux is interestingly related to it. But you might say, when you have C.I. Lewis and Sellars, you have then many systems. Does that make them a strong correlationist in some threatening reality? Yeah, that's what I thought you might say. So, the idea is you might have certain things, say in C.I. Lewis, he grants to Kant, the very idea of an object comes with some notion of lawfulness. Now, it doesn't have to be, it can differ very much in how it's realized, if you want to say. And that's the picture I find in Sellars as well, where you have a sequence of self-correcting different systems of, are they correlationist? Well, there's a highly abstract truth in correlationism which has something to do with mind independence, representing lawfulness in the broadest sense, but then how it's realized, and the thing is, I think this is already in Kant in the appendix and so on, so is already open to a massive empirical plurality and development, and then you could bring in cross-cultural differences too if you wanted, but the sense in which things, that's what I meant by objective correlationism. There are certain things, and you're right, it's a commitment. This commits you already to the sorts of things Meillassoux, in a way, wants to get beyond, and that's what's interesting to me about Meillassoux, even that highly abstract thing that can supposedly be relatively realized in different ways. You know, he's trying to say we need to get beyond that, but so that's the one thing I would say about it's not so neat. The many modes, all the ways in which thoughts differ across conceptual systems and over time can be consistent with a kind of commitment to a more abstract correlation.
My basic thing is just that, like, we all, almost everyone sitting in the middle thinks there's something in common and that there's some differences, right? There's huge amounts of variation over how much you think is necessarily in common and how much you think can vary. Right? There's huge amounts of that.
Right.
Where you hit strong correlationism is precisely at the point where people want to say it's completely open.
Right.
There's no way we can even attempt to place limits on. And as I say, it's indexed by denying non-contradiction. People going, but like, non-contradiction is just for us, that's not fair. And but really it's about denying any kind of universal structures. And interestingly, I don't want to take up too much time, but think of Rorty, right? So Brandon has this really... You don't have to, you can put your finger. But Brandon has this great paper on Rorty called Rorty's Art of Thought, from a limit of materialism to, I can't remember what it, but to whatever Rorty ends up at, which is like very strong conventionalism, right? And like, this is why Rorty's Art of Thought makes sense, is that you can even start out as like a radical empiricist about this stuff and be like, all of these structures of thought, all of it is purely empirical, there's nothing transcendental, it can all be revealed empirically, right? But as soon as you make that move, you're willing to slide all the way into, oh well, even non-contradiction is just something that happens to be contingent to particular structures of ours.
So, why is strong correlationism not, I mean, why does inquiry need to be simultaneously concerned with what is empirically available to it, as well as what could be empirically available to it, had its constitutional principles changed? I mean, this is why I was, and maybe I wasn't making much sense at this point in my paper, but this is why, I mean, it seems like you can face facticity in several different ways. And what Meillassoux does is show that the attitude of, well, we can't ground anything beyond discourse, so it's anything is fair game. That attitude then leads to Meillassoux speculative realism. It also leads to various forms of fideism and religiosity, and he doesn't like any of those things. But I mean, this was something that Gabriel, he's gone up there now. That he mentioned is, why do we have to constantly think in terms of this great outdoors, right? And this is why I wanted to push and make Kant a strong correlationist, or something along the lines of someone like Carnot, where that's just not a relevant question. And all you can do is just keep building models and fixing your conceptual relationships between those things without needing to, and because then the temptation is always there to follow the speculative realist argument for contingency. But he'll always say, well, look, it's contingent, what's going on within. And so we might have to then, play this Meillassoux game. I don't know, maybe this is not making sense, but...
If anybody else wants that.
Well, it relates to the importance of the dialectic that
Yeah.
one of the speaker respondents was talking about. Because I think it's kind of saying, stop asking certain kinds of questions. I slightly differed in the way I would put the beyond, because it doesn't, there's not a space. In the second critique, he says it can seem like there's a space beyond, and the answer is there's not. Which isn't to say you can assert that the empirical is all there is, but neither do you want to say there's a space beyond. That becomes our own moral aspirations and ideals, I think, that practical space. But it does have this implication for the sorts of questions that aren't fruitful to pursue.
But the answer that Meillassoux would give you, I think, to my mind, reveals the weakness of his whole characterization of correlationism, because he sets up the whole discussion at the beginning of the book with this caricature, right? The correlationist is a crude, knee-jerk idealist whose view Meillassoux thinks is really hardly better than creationism. He can't even, right? I mean, he says that at some point. He can't even believe in fossils. I mean, literally, I know that's a metaphor, but really, the correlationist view that he sets up as his foil is so crude that that's what's supposed to be motivating all of this. And I think you're absolutely right, that by the time you get into the thick of it, it turns out the actual philosophical adversaries are far more sophisticated than what he started with. And you're right, if you've got an Allisonian sort of Kant, which I assume, then, yeah, the things in themselves, the noumenal realm, isn't anything like a great outdoors. I mean, it's a kind of limit. It's a negative concept of what things are abstracted from the subjective conditions of our knowledge of them. It's nothing like the great outdoors. So the more I think about it, the less patience I have with the way Meillassoux sort of set up the argument.
One thing that's worth asking is, okay, if there is this, and you put this in a similar way in your talk, if there's this dogmatic temptation, right, which you say Meillassoux falls prey to, right, what's the other temptation? What's the other temptation that Meillassoux is perhaps fighting against, right? And ultimately, it is to reject the demand to explain things, right, in some way, shape, or form, right? Right, but all more form, and I wouldn't necessarily say this of Kant, but most of the strong correlationist stuff that Meillassoux is responding to, and this also applies to the sort of Brandovian, McDowellian sort of way of taking Sellars, right, is the therapeutic gestures. Is to say, no, we don't need, you're trying too hard, you don't need to, let's just stop. Everything's okay as it already is, right? And the thing is that is actually a very dangerous temptation.
But that's not the position I was suggesting is a good one.
No, but
yeah. I mean, I see how maybe what I was saying flirts with that, but it's also, but again, when we talk about convergent realism, you can understand convergence in many different senses, and it doesn't need to be this convergence of an endpoint or even an ideal endpoint or getting the picture right, but rather something that becomes inherently more and more reasonable or more reasonably acceptable as time passes. And that's a kind of convergence, I think, where it's not about, oh, everything's fine, just go about what you're doing. We live in a world right now that's incredibly irrational and incoherent in that respect. And so there is an ideal of convergence, but that isn't one that, it's not Plato. It's what you said. It's not Plato in a perfect world. It's whatever is a reasonable step from here, right now. I don't know.
But you've got to be willing. You've got to be willing to commit yourself to what that reasonability is, to some sense, right? Right. You've got to, which means you have to open yourself up to the possibility of genuine challenges that you aren't really being reasonable, like perhaps that you're being too therapeutic.
I think I mean, if you don't, I don't want to dominate the discussion, but I mean, just quickly, I think you're presenting a rather slippery slope, right? Because with Kant, as Jim put it, there's already a gesture of stop asking certain kinds of questions. The Copernican turn is, we've tried to think about how knowledge conforms to objects. Let's now think about what objects have to be to conform to our knowledge. It's a proposal, it's a suggestion, stop asking this question, start asking that question. It was sort of the beginning of what eventually leads to an extreme case of Rorty, who I think sort of flippantly says, I'm just going to change the subject. Bernard Williams once said, you can't effect a paradigm change just by saying that that's what you're doing. And there's a lot of sort of intermediate views there that you're right have therapeutic element. McDowell, certainly Heidegger, Wittgenstein, and so on. But it's not enough to just say, you are always under some categorical imperative obligation to answer any challenge to justify your position a priori. I mean, that's too crude, because sometimes it will be, I think, right and reasonable to say certain demands for justification or explanation really are misplaced. They're really.
What I'm saying is the one demand that you shouldn't be allowed to reason your way out of is the demand that we have an argument about what the demand is, right? Because what you might turn around is you might just go, I just know what reasonableness is, right? And I go, but maybe we should analyse that.
Well,
Maybe we should understand what the externality. And you might just say, oh, no, it's okay. I just already know what's reasonable and what isn't.
So this came up yesterday. Something like this came up during the Q&A after Gabrielle. How do we move from system to system? How do we move from one transcendental structure to the other? And I loved his response. He said there's no cookbook for that. And that you just have to wait for the historical juncture to come up, and otherwise. So, but that means, I mean, like, we're a bunch of philosophers in this room, right? And that's what we. I mean, this is why we have to distinguish between the philosophical task, right, of keeping up with what's going on in the sciences, and then what's going on in the sciences. And I think there can't be an answer for this kind of question until it is materially produced, I guess.
But if there is no answer, if there's no in principle answer to the question of what reasonableness is in some, and what I mean by that is, and this is what I was saying about the whole Kant versus Plato thing, right? And this is theory versus practice. This is the practical side of theoretical reason, right? Basically, we have to be able to have some idea of the finite procedure that we're engaged in, right? In order to then think of it at a limit and think of us as heading towards that limit, right? We have to be able to have some notion of the task responsibilities we've got, right? In order to see ourselves as approaching the standard, even if we can never in principle get there. And my worry is that a lot of the stuff that Meillassoux groups under strong correlationism involves various different ways of trying to weasel out of not just submitting to the standard, but even submitting to having the argument about what the standard is.
Yeah, I get that.
I mean, you could talk about regular principles in Kant here.
You posed a question to somebody else too. Was it Ray?
Yeah, Ray, do you want to say something about modal realism?
Yeah,
Or do you want to answer my answer?
No, but I'm not,
He's demanding a response, right?
your question was, is Meillassoux making a category mistake in using, attributing a descriptive use to modal vocabulary? And as you predicted, I would say yes. That's it. I think the modal expressivist account is correct. Your second question was, do I accept Brandon's modal realism, his allegedly Hegelian modal realism? Actually, I think no. And I think what Brandon does in that account is he ties it to his account of objective idealism. It's his kind of his supposedly non-metaphysical reconstruction of objective idealism. He says, well, look, if it's true to say what is necessary and possible, and obviously given that, if you can make true claims using descriptive vocabulary, you can make true modal claims. That's what's necessary and possible. So therefore, he says, well, if you're saying something true, there must be facts. If there are, kind of modal truths, there must be modal facts. There must be modal truth makers. And these are the modal facts, and these are just, he thinks, objectively kind of. The problem is that he says there's no problem in modal realism if you're willing to accept that reality can have a conceptual structure. Once it's granted that concepts need not be psychological. He says, I have a non-psychological conception of concepts. Fine, but we already know that with Sellars and Kant. The thing is, it's not enough to say that they're non-psychological if you're going to say that they can be fact constitutive. Okay? Because the problem is that concepts are tied to linguistic function. You cannot ontologize linguistic function indirectly through the medium of fact. And this is exactly what Sellars this is why Sellars refuses the temptation of modal realism, why he thinks that facts, that logical form, conceptual form, only belongs in the conceptual order, not the real order. And this is why he says, there is an in itself, but it doesn't consist of facts. Okay. Now I think things get complicated here. This is why I think Sellars rejects the Allisonian conception of the in itself as the Allisonian in itself is just what things are abstracted from any cognitive representational relationship to it. So it's a mistake if you're an Allisonian to hypostatize the in itself. There's no such, it's nothing. And Kant actually says this when he's talking about the problematic status. Things don't ask what things in themselves are. It's neither something nor nothing. It's not something that should be hypothesized. It performs a kind of a necessary conceptual role in transcendental, investigation. And I think part of that, I think, is correct. But then there's the issue, for Sellars, there's the issue about when Kant also insists that the idea of an appearance without something that appears is absurd. And Sellars follows up on this and says, the point he makes is that it's as much of a mistake to assume that things in themselves are radically different from appearances as that they are identical. And he says, the realm of the in itself could contain ties, paper clips, shoe shops as well. It's a mistake to think that the relationship between appearances and things in themselves isn't coordinated in terms of identity and difference. Okay? And that's a very difficult thing to say. So what I think the way to understand it for Sellars is that in a way the regulative function of the postulate of the in itself is to allow for a radical discrepancy or hiatus between our current descriptive and explanatory resources and what could come to be. This is why science is important, because when the discrepancy, why is science capable of astonishing us about with its descriptions and explanations? It's because we have to allow a radical revisability in a way that the postulate of the in itself is to allow a radical kind of a space of radical, the limit of commensurability between the descriptive and explanatory resources of the manifest image and of this new image that is in the process of being which is an ongoing historical construction, which is only 300 years old in one sense. So I think that's what if you make the Brandomian move of ontologizing facts without and Brandom says, I'm not doing metaphysics here. Okay? If you ask him what is a fact, he said, well, facts are not, they're supposed to be, their ontological status is not supposed to be kind of problematic. If you make the Brandomian move, what you're doing is that you surreptitiously ontologize linguistic function, okay? And then you reintroduce a kind of Aristotelian. You ratify the kind of the Aristotelian account, and you make it impossible to understand how we could revise the catalogue of substantial forms. Okay? And I think that when Sellars insists that science is a self-correcting enterprise, science, like the manifest image, is a self-correcting enterprise, the postulate of the in itself is the canon of corrigibility. And he says it has to be as radical as possible, so that it's not just, in order to be able to reason about reasoning, okay, you have to be able to allow, you have to have the resources to revise your catalogue of functioning, of what qualifies as a functioning, of what things do. If you ontologize modal categories, you think you already know what things can and cannot do. And science has told us that every time we think, every spontaneous delimitation of the difference between the possible and the impossible is always erroneous. It's, empirical science has pulverized our understanding of the possible. And I think that you can connect Sellars' skepticism to Bergson's critique of the very notion of possibility. I think actually Bergson's critique of the notion of possibility as a retrospective kind of conceptual fiction is actually correct. I think that this is why Sellars wants to say, now regardless of one's skepticism over the process stuff, he wants to say that if you're going to, if to be is to make a difference, the ways in which things are differentiated does not involve modality, possibility and impossibility. We want to, that's the way in which, and in fact you don't need that to understand what makes modal things true. You don't need truth makers to explain truth for Sellars. That's the power of his account, I think.
Does Brandom require that, though? I don't know enough about Brandom, but when you say he ontologizes these facts, I remember Brandom saying he's got a deflationary view of fact.
Yes.
This is what you're just saying,
Yes.
which is that a fact is nothing more than what's true, what you can truly assert, right? So there's mathematical facts. Facts come easy and cheap. So wouldn't his reply be, I'm not ontologizing anything because I'm not doing metaphysics, and fact is a cheap word you can use anytime you're saying something true. There's a fact.
Well,
is that right?
but hold on a minute. But modal expressivism just told us that when you say that something is possible or necessary, these are metical, these are expressive.
Yeah.
These are not descriptive. They don't have a descriptive function. Now, when you characterize something as a fact, you're describing the world. You describe the world in terms of facts.
But he doesn't use the word fact that way, does
He does in
Or
his
he does.
Hegel.
Well,
Yes.
isn't it something in between, so that it's, he thinks Sellars is wrong in his in Sellars' arguments against properties, facts, and so on, because Brandom thinks you don't need to worry about these things. So in one sense, he's not a heavy ontologist about them, but on the other hand, he thinks Sellars' nominalism, metalinguistic nominalism, is too worried about than just using realist language about them.
Yeah.
That Sellars, once he's given you a pragmatic meta-vocabulary, then what Sellars does is confuse then, this is Brandom's view, I think
Yeah.
Ray was right in all the things he was saying, and it's a delicate issue.
Yeah.
But Brandom thinks you should just go ahead, and he thinks Sellars confuses pragmatic meta-vocabularies with the expressivism, and then the harmless semantic assertions that you can make at that point to say
Yeah.
there are facts, there are modal necessitations out there.
Yeah, I see.
And because you've combined it with the expressivism, he thinks it's not anything to worry about. It's
Right.
some sort of position like that.
Right.
But I was interested in the thing about the in itself being linked with the fallibilism and the idea of radical change, which I think does fit with the conceptual convergence replacement schemes thing. So that is one strong thing in Sellars. When Einstein replaces Newton, you are, as it were, living in a different world. As Kuhn would say, it's a rational sequence for Sellars, unlike Kuhn. But the world of Newtonian mass is a world of appearances relative to the in itself, which is Einstein at that point. And then the in itself is always what the next characterization is, and the previous ontology is the appearances, which we've explained in those later terms. But my only thing is that if I look at science, I'm not kind of convinced if I look at biology, if I look at the way things seem to go, I'm not convinced that model of ontological replacement is cleanly universalizable across all excellent science that gets at how things are. In biology, I would think a more functional levels of realization approach, like his father, Roy Wood, would have had. And then, of course, the color thing is the other supposed argument for the necessity of an in itself that's different than the entire object ontology of the manifest image. But again, if you don't have that, so I like that. I think it's a bit like, I like regulative convergence views of some kind, but the way Sellars cleanly universalizes it to have the scientific image versus the manifest image still strike us. I want some of what you want.
Part of the problem is that he thinks that there is, or can be, or shall be, some one scientific image. Right. I mean, that's part of what he got from his logical empiricist contemporaries that fortunately were unlearning.
But I do, it is true, like when Ray was saying several things over the last couple of days, it does, that McDowell, I'm sympathetic with the idea that McDowell, and this is what Pete was saying as well, there is a kind of confidence that we've got the right broad conceptual frame. You know, there's look, you know, McDowell says in Mind and World somewhere, there's no reasonable chance that we're going to be wrong about middle-sized colored objects. You know, I mean, that's a quote from lecture 2 or 1 or something. And that's the difference. Sellars has got much more the Persian spirit from science that everything radically evolves, logic evolves, and the changes that are here should give you a spirit of, you know, McDowell will reply to that and says, oh, I know we have an obligation to reflect on the goodness of our scheme, but it's not with that same feeling that things can really change very much. So that's, yeah. And maybe Heidegger has that same confidence.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what scientific discovery ever convinced you that the sky isn't blue and grass isn't green? I mean, it's like, this is a question, I guess, about how to understand the relationship between the scientific image and the manifest image, because that is radically different, right? Whether there's sort of inconsistencies and whether the one forces you to give up these sort of ordinary common sense beliefs, I think is a...
No, it's not, they turn out to be true, but it's not a crazy idea that many of the things, the way we conceptualize them in ordinary life, the way we can see things moving and colored and subject to all kinds of influences is mistaken in important ways. Even though you'll still say that
seems very implausible to me. I mean, and maybe I was thinking of a way to distinguish it. The terminology that Heidegger uses to distinguish truth from reality. That's to say, yeah, but there's a sense of reality in which all this ordinary stuff is not real. If by real you mean, you know, the scientific image that you get to through inquiry and rational inquiry and so on and so on. But it remains perfectly true that jalapenos are spicy and the sky is blue and so on. I mean, you were saying Sellars draws a distinction between true and really true,
yeah.
Right? And I don't quite like the really, like that it trumps the true, but there's two...
Well, he wouldn't like distinguishing truth from reality. What's
Yeah,
the reality
yeah.
of the things we say about
No, so I'm trying to draw some kind of distinction where I'm getting a little bit of an echo in Sellars, which
Yeah.
is there's two kinds of questions you can ask. Am I wrong when I say grass is green? I don't see why I guess I'm with McDowell and the
I think we're
the
mostly
Quasis
wrong
says-
about what we think about the mind, probably, right? Folk psychology, we're learning a lot, and folk physics. So, you know, I'm open to, my thing is it should be a contingent question, how much of our ordinary life world is plausibly replaceable,
I mean, can I ask-
and Sellars makes it some necessary thing.
Well, I think we're just disagreeing about the extent of that, sort of where that reasonable disagreement can be. I mean, at one point McDowell refers to epistemological sanity, and I think it's just, it would be insane.
But I
to
think
be
that
saying-
you're
Things that move fast change their mass. They're moving towards being like ordinary people.
Ordinary common sense doesn't have any view about that. I don't.
Yeah,
Yes, it did.
Mass is a technical term.
I mean, I think there are certain domains in which you it is true that you're going to be warrantedly assertable in ordinary life in saying the things you
That's
say.
closer to what I'm saying. Yeah, that's right. Right.
And Sellars is happy with that.
Yeah, that's
I mean,
closer to my point.
With some, I mean, it seems like you're taking something more gravely than you should. My understanding of Sellars is whenever he says something is false, all he means by that is that there's another way to explain it, which isn't given. So when something's false, it doesn't mean you can't use that description or that label or that word. So things continue to be spicy, things continue to be green, and you can use those justifiably, and you can assert those things and use them and tell people why you use them. But when he says that something's false, such as the manifest image is false, that all that means is that there's a different perspective you can take
Well,
on
but
it.
he thinks he thinks the manifest image and scientific imagery in conflict.
Well,
And I'm not
because
convinced
of
of that.
but only in particular. I mean, he has particular arguments for this inconsistency. I mean, I find these things convincing. Others that don't have to. But I mean, the general point is that when something's false, all that means is that it's not that you're unjustified in using it. It just means that there's another way to look at it. But then
wrong.
this is,
I don't think that's all it means.
you don't think that's all it means.
That's right.
One way of putting it is to focus on the two different normative standards, and this is the way I've tried to frame it, right? And this is what I meant when you talk about like objectivity and something weaker than objectivity, called objectivity or whatever. There's two different standards. The question is how you relate those, right? One way to describe Sellars' view would be to say, yes, the manifest image and the scientific image are in conflict, but only from the perspective of the scientific image. Right? It's only when the manifest image is taken as a candidate for the stronger standard that it's in conflict.
That's
It's
what
not.
that's what leads Churchland. I remember him saying this, that it's of course only when you take the sort of folk psychological, let's say call it common sense view as folk psychology, which means it's a theory, that you then see it as potentially radically false. Relative to sort of full-blown adequate scientific theory. But that's where I think Heidegger and Wittgenstein would get off the train at the very beginning, that common sense is not a theory.
But there's the other way you can go, which is you can see the two as in conflict from the perspective of the manifest image. And so, for instance, Paulsen is the perfect example of this, where like ultimately the actual standard of scientific explanation is really just given by observation. And what observation is, well, who knows, but like...
He doesn't.
But
No.
I think there's an interesting point here to be made about the thing itself. So when your manifest world, something turns out to be false, scientists tell us that things are different than they actually are, whatever, any example you want. I mean, this is what I was trying to say to you at the beginning of this conversation, which is that you don't really need to be agnostic about something. You can't be agnostic about something that you don't even know about yet. So when science progresses and starts to reveal certain things to you, and this is why I like to think of the thing in itself as just this. It's like this empty drawer that more reality comes out of. Like when you just have more and more concepts, you have more and more worlds.
Outdoors.
And no, but really, I mean, it's just we have more conceptual schemes, and we go further with them, and we explain the previous ones. It's not like there's a real in itself, but the in itself functions always as that. That basically, but then that's why. There's no problem with strong correlationism, because you're not really agnostic about anything, unless you make the mistake of saying that you're agnostic about something.
The problem is you always have this special card in your back pocket, which enables you at any point to end the conversation. It'd be like, no, explanation stops here. Interestingly, this is precisely what Meillassoux does. Is Meillassoux goes, that card is actually a metaphysics. He goes, turns out there isn't no ultimate ground of anything, so just we can stop when we like. And that,
Okay, I see your point. I see your point. Yeah.
No one should be allowed to have that card. That's the end.
You're the policeman.
Yeah, I've got a T-shirt.
Okay, I can see that.
Well, it is kind of time if you feel it's a good place to start.
Just very quickly,
Yeah.
you said that you thought it was more complex than that, but you didn't say why.
Who are you pointing at?
Which, about
The false.
the falsehood? Oh, no, that insofar as we've got either progressions in scientific theories and explanations, or we've got some conflicts between ordinary common sense and some variety of scientific theory, the newer science is claiming to be more accurate about some domain of phenomena, some domain of occurrences. So it's not just another way of looking at it. It's
Well, surely you can
claiming
be
to be more
incorrect.
precise.
You can be incorrect. But then when you're not incorrect, but it's still false. So the sky is blue. That's correct, but it's false. In the
I
sense,
have
that
no idea what you're saying.
No, I mean if we look out the window, the sky is blue, right? And we all look
No,
at
right
it.
now it's gray.
Well, okay, fine. Say it's a sunny day.
Cloudless
It's
sky.
blue, but the sky and space is not blue. That's what I mean by saying that it's it's false.
Read Bill Hayes' presidential address to the APA under the blue dome of heaven.
Okay.
Very nice piece of pragmatic realism.
There is an interesting middle ground, Taylor, maybe between, you can reject Churchland's that our common concepts are theories.
Yeah.
I mean, Sellars does in scientific realism and Analytic instrumentalism. It's because they're not theories, because there's no thing independent base that they're explaining. That there's not like, you might, that's what the positivists wanted sense data to be, the thing that our ordinary objects were theories with respect to, and Sellars rejects that. Nonetheless, Sellars says science is continuous with common sense. Science grew out of common sense because common sense is abductive as well. It has a sort of picture of how things are. And I think to deny that common sense, ordinary life, is in one sense in the game of saying how things are in its way, and to say it's just making moves that are nothing like that, underestimates the degree to which we do say how things are.
I think that's right, yeah.
So I guess I want to be a fallibilist about, and I think Sellars ought to have been more Persian than he was, about which things get replaced, which
Yes.
things are going to overturn
Part
what
of it is he's
things.
so dominated by, again, that contemporaneous reductionist view that there's going to be one fundamental scientific image, and it's going to be whatever physics ultimately tells us. And, you know, thank goodness we're getting over that one, because it's not accurate.
The Meillassoux thing, just by the way, I'll have to ask Fabio, who knows Badiou, and that all this Cantor moves, which are crucial, has the weight of public opinion confident in the way he uses Cantor in these ways to do what he wants to do. This is just a sheer question from ignorance. No. I'm ready for wine now.